Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're middle of page 1217. Aleph Resh Yud Zayin. The pages can be found if you need them at ayinbeis.com. The PDFs you can view or download. Okay. So we reviewed and probed a bit deeper into the parentheses, which is how the Rebbe Rashab explains the idea of his salmus, concealment in context of his nasus atzmi, which is really beyond revelation and concealment. Two explanations that he gave, and I'm pretty confident to say that the last way I explained it is the correct way. So one explanation is that it's because his nasus atzmi comes into a state of his galus and revelation Malchus, so then they could say it's shaykh that Malchus should now in the state have something to conceal. Whereas when it's in a state of his nasus atzmi and its own, there's nothing to conceal because there's nothing revealed. The salmus is only a fundamental, like he says, a salmus ba'atzmai. It's all within himself. It's not due to some other force like a parsa or a tzimtzum, which is a power of concealing something that's capable of being concealed, revealed, because it's in a state of revelation. The second explanation is, even if you say it's nasus atzmi, but there's a power, it's nasus atzmi, so there's a power that is the power to conceal something, like he said with the chachma, the moichen, the godless. Someone who's a powerful mind has the power to conceal, and like he calls it la'akev, to restrain himself, and so therefore, it's not that it's that this nasus atzmi relates to concealment. It just has the power to conceal the higher faculties. The faculties, what he called the eres v'giluim shemisalmin ba'etzem. So it's like essentially when we talk about the koyach tzimtzum, the tzimtzum arishin, it's not. It says yes, the tzimtzum affects the light. That's what it affects. But the power to create tzimtzum is coming from koyach atzmos. That atzmos just has the power to reveal. He has the power to conceal. So revelation is one track, concealment is another track. So we're not talking about the entity itself being concealed. We're talking about the power to conceal. That would be the second explanation. Okay. We did explore the option that maybe the second explanation is an extension of the first one, and he's just talking about not the concealment that follows Malchus, but the concealment how Malchus conceals the higher levels. But I don't think that's the pshat when I read it again and again. Okay, so then we continued after the parentheses, and this is all in the context of how Ani Risha and Ani Achrin, Keser Malchus, all the way to Malchus of Malchus, all the way to becoming a Keser of Bria. So Malchus fundamentally always remains in this type of dual paradoxical relationship to that which it relates to. Chesed, for example, has a very straightforward relationship. You love something, so there's a relationship. It's closeness. Malchus, on one hand, the melech is there. He's chosen to be melech. We said there's the awakening, a stimulation of his nasus atzmi. There's a desire to be king. And then there's the actual implementation of that. But even when he's doing that, he's still in a state of Havdalah because he still remains a melech. And it's not an equal type of relationship. It's a relationship with another, with something outside of himself, which has nothing in common with the melech. Like we said, it's not children. It can't be family. It can't be, as he says, L'kutei Torah, you're not a melech over your very body. You don't call it that. There, it's more of very much a united entity. Whereas here you have these both elements, and as a result of the Havdalah, like he calls in the Psalms, of this nasus, of Malchus, being always removed, that's why it contributes. And as he just, as the last lines we read, behind the B'chinas nasus atzmi, B'chinas Keser Malchus, Aydei zed dafke nasa, B'chinas hatzimtzum v'arichuk, sheyochel liyas habriya ma'ayin liyesh, B'chinas Malchus sheba Malchus. So specifically, Malchus remains somewhat removed, that due to that, you can have it has the proper distance, so to speak, from its subjects to be able to create something yesh ma'ayin that should have its own independent entity. Whereas if the creation came from higher levels of Giluyim, the Giluyim would be too close and would not allow for an independent existence that's outside. That, like I said, the Melech and the Am are Zorim v'nefradim. They're separate, they're strangers, and they're separate from the king. And yet they have that relationship. Now, as you said on the top of the page, this shouldn't be seen as only distance, because Malchus also manifests Isavas Bapel through a kiruv, because then the Asarim Amoris, Nivra Elam, the words and the permutations of the letters, they actually bring in the actual details of creation, every aspect, like he explains in. Okay, good. But that also includes that it's all after the parsa, which conceals, and that parsa itself is a result of Malchus's so-called distance or separation. Good. So we're up to the line now, which is also still, all this is based on the Likkutei Torah in the explanation in Bolok, Mi Mono, that I cited some of it yesterday. So the continuation is also from there. So now it goes a step further. Because right now we said that Malchus allows the space, like he says, but he's now going to add one more thing. And this level of Malchus Sheba Malchus, which, as we said, is in a state of Isnasus Atzmi in Atzilus. So even when it becomes Keser of Bria, it's still removed and therefore allows space for the creation. In other words, creates due to the concealment. He says, in addition to just allowing space and allowing the creation, it becomes the amitis kiyumam achris savusam. Even after Biyah and the creations and the creatures of Biyah are created, their real sustenance comes from this level of Malchus. Ukiyidu b'mashakosav yiras Hashem l'chaim. The yiras Hashem, it brings them life. That's how he's titled. Shamalochim, referring to the angels, and the angels we know begin in Bria. Mipnei hayira elikisha aleim chaim v'kayomim yeser. Due to their yira, in other words, it's not just that they're getting a flow of energy, which would be, the energy source comes from Malchus, which channels the creative power that we've been discussing, creation. But it's more than that. That their yira, meaning their awe of the king, of Malchus, is actually, that they have, is chayomim v'kayomim. Through that, because of their yira, their awe. That's why chayim v'kayomim yeser. That makes them more alive and more sustained. So you could say one thing is, okay, you stand in awe of the king because he's beyond you. You even want to have a relationship with him in some way, whatever is possible, to serve a higher reality. In this case, God, obviously. But he's saying furthermore, that the actual Yiras HaMelech, he doesn't say Melech here, but clearly the Yira of, meaning standing in Bittul to this level, that actually adds and increases in life and the sustenance of the creation, the creatures, the creations. And your awe or your fear, Meiracha is your awe. Let's use awe. Is upon them. So in other words, not just upon them that they have awe, but it also gives them, upon them means also that it sustains them. Okay, so that's the additional point. And as I said, Likkutei Torah, he elaborates a bit more, I believe, about it. So now that's another point that doesn't change the whole equation. It's just adding, so we see how powerful this process for creation is necessary. So now he's going to say, go back, remember the operative verse he was using, besides Anirishim v'Aniachim, Bereshis bara, Elokim es hashamayim v'sa'aretz, and he said Bereshis was Chachma, and then it went through all the spheres, Bina and all the spheres on top of page 1216. So now he's going back, Val Pizeh, Ulafizeh, Yisparish Mashakosa Bereshis bara. According to what we just learned now. So then the interpretation the way you would interpret Bereishis bara, the chen, sheish yamim asa. So both Bereishis bara, that the creation itself, the Bereishis, the chen sheish yamim asa, that 6 days he created, which is referring to the sheish yimei Bereishis, the 6 days of creation. By Esses Sfiras the Malchus. By Esses Sfiras the Malchus, remember we said we're talking about now the 10 spheres within Malchus. Before we were talking about the 10 spheres within Atzilus, starting from Keser all the way to Malchus of Malchus. Now he says, we're going to explaining the Bereishis. Before Bereishis was explained that Reishis receives from Keser. Reishis is Chachma. That in turn goes into Bina, and then it goes into all the spheres. As I said, he explained on top of page 1216. Now he says, according to what we've been displaying, that all this is in the 10 spheres of Malchus. Yes, so now it's explained. Now we're explaining it in the context of the 10 spheres of Malchus, because in Malchus itself it has this whole process. So it's just like he explained it in the macrocosm. In order for there to be the transmission from Keser Malchus, which we said was the revelation of Isnasus Atzmi, the fundamental transcendence and exaltedness, and the Ratzon, the desire to rule, to govern. He says, so in order for there to be that transmission into Bechinas Malchus, Sheba Malchus, Li'isei Savus, Zewaidem Tsois Esespheres the Malchus. So in order for there to be, it should go all the way from the highest level, all the way into Malchus of Malchus, where the creation takes place, as we explained. That's through the intermediary, the interface of the 10 spheres of Malchus. So exactly as he explained it, as I said, on page 1215 and 1216, if you remember, he asked the question on 1215, you tell me these Savas is from Malchus, so why does it say Bereishis bara Elokim, which is Chachma? So he explained the whole idea of Atzilus, that you need the whole Atzilus to be an interface, and it goes from Chachma, the Nakuda, from desire comes a Nakuda point, which is then shaped by Bina, and then fully developed in the Midas, in Zah, all the way to Malchus, like he said at the bottom of the page. If you remember from the Pelech HaRiman, where he said about the idea of Galufi Aglif, Ahustimot Kedisha, that from Keser to Chachma, into Bina, into the rest of the spheres. So the same thing now we're saying is in the context of the same concept of Bereishis bara Elokim that we learned, and Sheishes Yamim, which of course referred to the 6 midas of Zah, Chesed through Yesod. All this is now being applied as possible through the 10 spheres within Malchus itself. So he's concluding what he said at the beginning of the paragraph on page 1216. The Bechinas Keser Malchus, Bechinas Isnasus Atzmi, Shezeh Bechinas Helam. Keser Malchus is Isnasus Atzmi, which is in a state of concealment. Begam Bechinas HaRatzon de Keser Malchus. Ime Yeshu Bechinas Ratzon Goli Kolzo Adayim B'Madregas HaAtzilus. So you'll say, one second, didn't we just say that's in state of reveal? Right, but we're talking about it's concealed from the lower levels, just like Keser is an active Ratzon and an active Isnasus, but it's not yet something that you could say relates to another yet. It's all within the Melech himself. So like he said in the page before, when he said that through the Hachtorah, through Keser Malchus, he said, Ratzon Melucha, but it's still in a state that's higher than the Am. It's not yet Isnasus ala Am. Even though it's the source of it, because without it being revealed, without it manifesting and becoming a desire, it won't move to the stage where the Melech becomes an actual Melech, king over the people, but it's still one step above that. So the same thing is in Keser Malchus. The Keser Malchus is still a state of Helam, and also the Ratzon of Keser Malchus, which means Arich, the second level of Keser Malchus, like he said on the previous page. Ima Yeshu B'chinas Ratzon Golei, even though it's a revealed desire, it's still in the levels of Atzilus, because it's still not yet reached Malchus Sheba Malchus, which will become Keser of Biyah. So it's still in the levels of Atzilus. Sheba Atzilus, hu b'chinas Ratzon Gali. In Atzilus, it's a revealed desire. But compared to Biyah, which in the Moshel would be the people, the nation, it's still concealed because they don't have a king, actual king yet. They just have the early processes of the king preparing himself to associate and have a desire to want to be their king or their ruler. So it's still the Helamadan. And you can't call it yet a makar mamish, a literal source, which means a direct channel to biyah. It's ultimately the siba, the cause, but you can't call it a direct source until, and here it goes. The Reish says galus, and so we're talking now all the 10 spheres in Malchus. So he's literally saying everything we learned in the previous pages in the general Atzilus, the macrocosm, he's now explaining in Malchus. So Keser Malchus, the Keser within Malchus, is still removed, relatively speaking. But Reish says galus b'chinas chochma sheba Malchus. So just like we said, chochma Atzilus in the macrocosm is the beginning of the revelation in Akuda. In Malchus itself, chochma sheba Malchus is the beginning of the revelation in chochma sheba zeu hamaymer de Bereishis, and that's what Bereishis means. Remember, Bereishis is chochma. Rishain is keser. Umizgali Yesu b'chinas hamidah sheba Malchus. He skips Bina because he's relying, I guess, that we would understand it from what we learned earlier. And it becomes more revealed in the Midas, in the 6 emotional attributes of Malchus. Those are the 6 days, the 6 emotions. So you have Breishis Bara, Chachma of Malchus. Sheshis Yamim Asa is the 6 Midas within Malchus. Ad Shaba, till it comes and arrives, Malchus Sheba Malchus. In Malchus itself, the Malchus of Malchus. So we have the Keser within Malchus, the Chachma within Malchus, the Midas, the 6 emotions, the 6 emotional attributes within Malchus, till Malchus of Moshe, Nasa b'chinas Keser lebriya, b'chinas isnasus al am. Now it's become a crown for Biyah. So it's not just a Keser that remains in Malchus itself, that desire or the beginning of him relating to his nasus atzmi, which compared to the nation is concealed. It's only within the king. But now it's become our actual king, Keser of Biyah. B'bchinis makif aleim. Yet it's still in the state of makif. But now at least it's a king of this nation. It's a state of makif, a transcendent state still. Li is b'bchinis makir. But now it's become a makir. So now it's a source for the nation, as we know about above, as we spoke. It creates, so it's the makir of their being. Like he said, is their primary sustenance and their existence. And then the Rebbe Rashab qualifies, and yet the gamzeh b'chinas makir klali adayin. We can call it a source, but it's still a general source, like he said at the bottom of the last page, 1216. There we call koyach hapoel haklali, because it still needs to associate. The king is now a king over the nation, but he's still not, so to speak, governing and instructing details, like appointing an agricultural department, a tax department, so to speak. In other words, the actual specific details of Yehi Rakia, like the Isis, that would be already prati. Here, it's Keser of Bria, but it's still a Keser. And then that Keser will then be Mamshech Chachma Bina Das in Bria itself, in Bria and in Bia in general. So now we have this, basically a second, I don't call it a second interpretation. He basically explained it in macrocosm and microcosm in Malchus itself. And now he concludes, V'zehu, Ani Rishon. This is the verse we began with. Ani Rishon. Ani is Asius Ayin. Remember we learned Ayin, V'ubchinas Ayin de Keser. Because referring to the bittul, the Ayin of Keser, Ani Rishon, and then this will lead all the way into Ani Achron, as we're going to explain the next paragraph, which is Malchus. Okay. So with that, we conclude this paragraph on page 1217. I think it's pretty clear, but if anybody has any questions, now's a good time. All clear? Okay. So now we're going to learn the next paragraph, and this is going to lead us to the bottom of the next page. It's going to conclude this Ani Arish and Ani Achron, which began the explanation of understanding how in Gan Eden, which is in the world of Bria, you have a Gili of Atzilus that's unfiltered. So we're going to understand that soon. But let's continue this paragraph. So v'yuven zeh, we continue on. V'yuven zeh b'bchinas Malchus, and this will be understood in the state of Malchus. Da'nidishin u'bchinas kesem Malchus. It seems to me that he's repeating what he said, but maybe not. Let's just see how he's going here, because he already said this, but okay. Maybe he's going back to the general macrocosm. That's possible also. Let's see. Well, let's read inside and I'll explain it. So we'll understand this in the state of Malchus. I am the first. Remember, Rishin, hu b'chinas kesem Malchus. Now that's the microcosm. That's kesem Malchus. Shenikra Rishin sheb'chinas havdalah adayin. It's called Rishin. So it is a first emanation, as we learned. So it's a first. So in other words, it is the beginning of something, but it's still removed. You can't call the actual part of the process. That's Rashis. The Chochma Nikr Rashis, Shubchinis Rashis is Galus. Mibchinis Ahelam the Ayin the Kesem. Chochma is called Rashis. So this we learned already. It didn't say anything new right now. It just seems to be summing it up. So Chochma is called Rashis Chochma, because it's already a makabel, as we learned, Rashis Lashon Nekeva in the feminine, because there you already have the gilui of at least a nekuda. In Kesed, the nekuda is only a dot. In Chochma, it already starts taking on at least basic shape. So that's the beginning of the Isgalus, like the beginning of consciousness starts in Chochma. The B'chinas Ahelim, the Ayin, the Kesed. Yes, and it's coming from the concealed state in the Ayin and Ani, as in Ani, the letters Ayin of Rishon. The Kamoi Kain, who b'chinas Chochma Sheba Malchus. So yes, he's explaining it now. He's comparing it to what we discussed earlier. It's a little more elaboration, it looks like. Same thing is just like Chochma in general in Atzilus is the beginning of the revelation from the concealed state of Keser. Same thing as Chochma in Malchus is also like that. Shu is Galus the b'chinas Keser Malchus shenikra Rishon shemuv d'ladai. That it's a form of revelation of Keser Malchus, which Keser Malchus is still somewhat removed. It's still in a state of being moved on. Okay. What I was thrown was for a moment was because of the new paragraph. So I thought the new paragraph was going to be another dimension in all of this. The truth is, this is really an explanation of the last lines we learned in the previous paragraph, where he said what Chochma Sheba Malchus achieves. It also almost seems to me, if I may go on a limb to say, that it almost sounds like that if the Rebbe Rashab were to divide Maimorim, remember he didn't divide this into this separate discourses, that maybe Ayin the Kesser would have been the end of a Maimer, and then it would have been that would lead into the conclusion of a Maimer, and V'yuven Zeh would be basically continuing like he does, as we've seen in the previous volumes, where he finishes an Inyan, then he starts the Inyan by first summing up what we learned before. It sounds a little like that because the flow seems to be almost in that fashion. I can't say for sure, but reading it, it sounds like that basically the end of this paragraph was like almost an indicator that if he was going to become a Maimer, that's what he would have done. So that would maybe mean that the Rebbe Rashab was ready to say this and divide this into Maimarim, but it lays time mills, it just didn't work out time-wise or whatever the reason may have been, which is interesting because many of us thought that the Rebbe Rashab, after he left Lubavitch, he only continued to write Ayin Beis and not deliver it. But it's possible that he was going to continue to deliver, but I can't say for sure. I'm just, as I read it, and used to the Rebbe Rashab's language, it sounds to me a bit like that. Because really what he just said now was explaining essentially what Chachma is compared to Kesem Malchus Chachma. Okay, just as an aside. And now he starts to explain another thing in this. Because till now we said Ani Rishon, okay, Ani is Eishis Ayin. And he spoke about the Ayin of Keser before, and Ani Achren is the Ayin of Malchus. That was back on page 1214. Yeah. So now he's going to explain, so why is Ayin and Ani, why they reversed letters? So he says, Umashakosov Ani, Hipuch Asfun, Ayin, Koya B'chinas HaChochma. So why does it say Ani Rishon? Why doesn't it say Ayin Rishon? So the fact that it says Ani in the reverse order of the letters Ayin, meaning reversing the Nun and the Yud, so that he says is referring to Koyi al B'chinas HaChochma sho is galus mehelam HaKeser. Actually, I don't know if it's a new subject. It's all within it. So Ani Hepech Hazman Ayin Koyi al B'chinas HaChochma sho is galus mehelam HaKeser. Let me read on, and then I'll try to explain what this means. Let me finish reading, and then I'll explain. And that's Ani Rishon. Keser and Chochma. Hainu Kamesh HaChochma miyuchedes b'Keser. Okay, got it. So we said, so far we've said Ani Rishon, that's Keser. The Ayin, Ani, Ayin of Keser. And that leads into Chochma. Chochma reveals, like we learned before, Chochma is the Yesh compared to the Ayin of Keser. Keser being concealed, so it's in a state of Ayin, like a Nakuda that doesn't even have any shape yet. Chochma begins to have shape, so it's called Yesh. So Ani Rishon. But based on that, the Chochma level is not included in the verse. You only have Ani Rishon, Ani Achren. The beginning, Keser Rishon, and Malchus is Ani Achren, the last of the levels. But now he's explaining that because it says Ani, not Ayin, the Ani means an I, there is an entity here. So he's saying that's hinting to, Koy means it's referring to, on the level of Chochmah, that's revealing the Helam of Keser. In other words, the Pasuk is alluding to more than just I am Ani Rishon, I am the beginning, I am the first, as in Keser. The Ani, which is the reverse order of Ayin, which is referring to Chochmah as it connects to Keser. So an Arishan would be Keser, which is a level of Ayin, and Ani Rishon would be Ani. Chochmah is I am connected with, and miyuchedes, like he says, be Keser. So it's more than just referring to Keser, it's also referring to the union, how Chochmah is receiving from Keser and connected with it, like a student receiving from its teacher. Remember, Keser is the root, is the source of Chochmah. Chochmah is a conscious revealed state. Keser is a superconscious state. So he's saying now that Ani in Rishon is referring to Chochmah as it's part of and receiving and uniting with Keser. So the Ani really has two meanings. It is the letters Ayin, which is the bitl of Keser, but it also Ani, as the word Ani, I am Rishon. Chochmah is saying, I am Rishon, I am one with Rishon Keser. That's how he seems to be interpreting. So now the verse is also therefore alluding to, referring to, including the process from Keser to Chochmah, and then it's going to end up in Ani Achren, at the end of the process in Malchus. But we'll get to that. Right now he's talking about that first step. So yes, he's indeed... One second. So he's indeed adding new points here. In this context, he now added this point. Till now, an addition was Keser. And in contrast to Reishis, Keser is removed. But now he's including Chochmah within those Anirishon. So it's Keser and Chochmah. 1 second. Does anyone want to ask something?
Ayin is Keser on Ani is Chochma, right? Because it says Galus from Kesser, right? Because Ani is more is Galus.
I just explained that. Yes, I just explained that last. Yeah, correct.
So the Ani Rishon is also not Kesser, right? The Ani Rishon. Right?
Well, if you say Ani Oisius Ayin, it refers to. I just said it has two meanings here. In general, it's Ayin of Keser, but now you go further, deeper. He's saying the Ani is alluding unto Chochmah, which connects with Keser.
What does S-fine mean?
What?
Hepech S-fine Ayin?
Is the opposite. Ayin is Ayin, Aleph, Yud, Nun. Hepech Asfin means the letters are reversed. Asfin is Asius, and Hepech is that you're reversing the letters. Ayin and Ani. If it was just Keser, it would be Ayin. The fact that it's Hepech Asfin, the opposite, it's a different reversed letters.
Okay.
Ani is Hepech Asfin Ayin.
It's letters. It means letters, right?
Asfin is letters, yeah. Why is this so complicated? It's
Just
it's called reversing the letter or the order of the letters.
No, it was just the word I wanted to know.
Okay, that's it. Yeah. Okay. Continuing on. Any other questions?
I have a question. Is he saying here the difference between what it would mean, what it would mean if it said the Ayin Rishon as opposed to the Ani Rishon? In a sense,
No.
he's alluding to the fact that Keser comes before Chachma. No, there's nothing there.
It's exactly what I just said. He's saying the word Ani Rishon, Ani, since it says Ani, so it's referring to Chachma as it unites with Keser. So Ani would be Chachma and Rishon would be Keser.
It seems like there's a suggestion that, well, you might think it's the Ayin Rishon. If he's saying it's a Hepech Asma, then what would it mean if it weren't Hafuch?
Well, it isn't, but it is Hepech Asma. It is. The pasuk says Ani, it doesn't say Ayin. So Ani has an element in it that it hints. Ani has an element in it that it hints to Ayin, which would mean the Ayin of Keser, as he's not contradicting what he said till now. He's adding. He said, Ani Rishon is in general Keser, because Ani is the letters Ayin. Now he's going further. The fact that it says Ani, you can say, therefore it also alludes to Chachma, which is a state of Ani, a state of a Yesh, I, an I, that is Chachma as it's united with Rishon, with the Keser. Simply adding to the interpretation. Okay.
Thank you.
So continuing on. V'zehu we can say Lefisha b'chachma dayin gam ken b'chinas pshitus u'b'chinas nekuda dayin, because chachma is still, even though it's in a revealed state compared to Keser, compared to the desire, compared to the superconscious state. Nevertheless, since chachma is still relatively a shapeless entity and still a nekuda, it's a yud. It's not like the nekuda of Keser. It actually b'chinas nekuda denotes. It's a nekuda that is wedged, like we said at the bottom of page 1215. We brought from the Zohar that nekuda denotes. It means it's a point, let's say, that an artist or a writer puts on paper that's already leading, that point will then be developed. But it's still fundamentally a point. So Yesh Lemer is saying, because Chachma is still, relatively speaking, to Bina, with its Shiur, where the shape and form begins to develop. It's still a point, canal, as we spoke earlier, Lechein, therefore, had a Zekel Esam Ve'emer Ani Rishon. That's why the pasuk Keil Esam includes it together with Keser. and says Ani Rishon. So he's adding another point now, because till now, Ani Rishon seems to be one level, Keser. Ani Rishon, Ani, in reverse, reorder the letters is Ayin. So that's Rishon, that's Keser. Vani Achrin is Malchus. Now that you're introducing Ani is also Chochmah, he's making the case stronger, because Chochmah is not just another entity. Chochmah is very similar to Keser in a certain way, because it's still a state of bittul. It's still a state of a nakuda. Yes, it's a lower level nakuda. It's already taking on shape, but in a sense, it has still that pshittus, the shapelessness of the divine as it is in Keser, before it's going to be shaped into a structure through Bina and the other midas, and the midas. So that's why the pasuk can encompass it. Ani Rishon is it's not like saying two opposites. That Ani Rishon, Chochmah and Keser, as they unite as one. Basically, how Chochmah is receiving from Keser and united with it. So that's what that's the Yeshlemer that he added in explaining the Ani Rishon, the Chochmah Keser relationship, which those of you may recall, and I'll just refresh your memory if you're or state it. This was a very central theme, especially in volume 1 of Ayin Beis, where he spoke at length about how Keser and Chochmah meet. We referred to it also at the end of volume 2, where he spoke about Chochmah being Riyah, if you remember. That Chochmah is visualizing. It's the first sphere. So on one hand, it's a conscious sphere, the beginning of the process, Reshis, the beginning of the process, but it's still fundamentally really beyond structure, because it still has that resonating truth. If you remember the end of volume 2, we discussed at length the difference between Chochmah and Bina, Riyah and Shmiya, that it's a form of like a resonating reality of the truth of something. Spoke different levels of that. That was where the Chelas Ava and all that came, because when you really can see something and not have it, it creates a very deep aching and longing. But the point being here that Chochmah is a very paradoxical entity in its own right. It's an interface essentially between conscious and the superconscious, as explained in volume 1. Or like to use the words from the Tanya, chapter 35, in the gloss, in the Hagah, the Alter Rebbe says, Shemaiti Memeir, I heard from my teacher, the Magid, that Chochmah is the level of Hu Levadei ve'ein Zulosei. He alone, God alone, and no other. In other words, Chochmah is really a state of bittul. Compared to Keser, Chochmah is already a yesh because something has emerged. But if you really talk about Chochmah, Chochmah is always referred to koyach ma, the power of ma, bittul. That's why it's only a nekuda. It's only a spark. And there's a certain resonating truth in it, because it's not yet become part of the full yesh that Bina will develop into a full fleshed out idea or concept and experience. So I'm just elaborating a bit to explain that Keser and Chochmah in that sense have a very deep, close relationship. And the Rebbe Rashab, that's why Ani Rishon, al Chochmah is miyuchid with Keser, because Chochmah is also a state of bittul. Low state, a little lower than Keser, but it's still, and you could even say the Ayin of Ayin, Chochmah is sometimes called Ayin. Chochmah ma'ayin timotze. Chochmah comes from Ayin, from Keser, but sometimes Chochmah is also called Ayin. He doesn't say that here. Here he seems to say that's Ani, but Ani is the letters Ayin. Now, if you may remember, in the volume 1, he spoke about the two interpretations in Zohar on Kiasisa Pella, that Pella is the letters Aleph. And he said two interpretations, that the Aleph of Chochmah is a keli to the Pella, the wonder and awe and grandeur of Keser. Or you could say the Aleph alone is Pella. It's the same level. So this is very reminiscent of those interpretations back in volume 1, where Aleph is of course Shema, the Mile Alphin, Bittel, Ma, as he explained there. So it's a level, is Chochmah, as Bittel of Chochmah, Keli to Keser, or it actually becomes one with Keser. So though he doesn't elaborate here, but it's very seems very connected to those themes, and it's a very central part of Ayin Beis, because ultimately this is where the interface between Elokus as it's higher than structure, in the case of Keser being the first Netzal, Rishon, and Chochmah, which is the first step in the process that's revealed.
Okay.
We've been talking here about the next part of the interface, and Atzilus is an interface, Malchus, which is going to connect Atzilus to Biyah. But this is the connection of Atzilus to that which is higher than Atzilus, what we just discussed right now. But now, that's again, especially, I'm elaborating because this is the real context of Ayin Beis. This is the larger theme. But now he's going to go back now to Ani Achrin, Vani Achrin Malchus. Okay. Somebody wanted to comment or ask something?
Why is it so important to add that Chochmah is also together with Kesser?
I just explained it for 5 minutes.
So I hear that Chochmah is having the quality.
So,
It's
but I just
having the
explained it in the
quality,
context
but
of
why is it
Ayin
so
Beis,
important to
that
Magnify?
it just enriches the whole relationship in the interface between Kesser and Chochmah. In other words, it's saying that Anid Yishen, the beginning, the process of Chochmah is very much connected to Kesser, so it deepens the interface.
You're talking now about Malchus. That Malchus is.
We didn't get to Malchus.
good.
Right now, we're talking about Kesser and Chochmah. Now he's going to go back to Vani Achrin. Anid Yishen is Kesser and Chochmah right now, not just Kesser. So it enriches the whole process. That is the beginning of the whole concept of how you move from the highest levels of Kesser Malchus all the way to Malchus Shemal. Now he's going to go. Let's see what he says. Vani Achrin, and the second half of the verse, the phrase, Vani Achrin, I am the last. What is that? Hu b'chinas Malchus sheba Malchus. So we talked about Kesser sheba Malchus, Chochmah sheba Malchus, Ani Rishon. Now, which becomes the crown and the kesser for the next stage of the cosmic order, Bria. And what form of kesser lebria? B'chinas isnasus, ub'chinas makif al elam abria. So Malchus Ani Achrin, in the end of the process, end of Atzilus, is Malchus sheba Malchus. The beginning is Kesser Malchus and Chochmah Sheba Malchus. Malchus Sheba Malchus then becomes the Kesser of Bria in a form of Hisnasis. It remains exalted, above, transcendent. Makif al Elam HaBria. So just like Kesser is the Kesser of Atzilus, and it's Hisnasis on Atzilus, and then moves into Chochmah and so on. The same thing now is at the end of Atzilus, Malchus Sheba Malchus, Ani Achrin of Atzilus, and Ani Achrin in Malchus, Ani Rishon, Ani Achrin in Malchus itself, Kesser Malchus. Malchus Sheba Malchus becomes the next level, Kesser of Bria. The Makif and the Kesser of Bria. So exactly the same process repeats itself, but now it's on a lower level. Because Kesser, we know, has Atik and Arich, so it has Isnasus, Atzmi, and it has Rotzen. So now it's all moved to a lower level to creation. Till now, we've been talking about emanation, Atzilus, still godly. Now we're talking about an independent creation where the real Am emerges. Okay. And so is it in each world and world, in each dimension. So the process now repeats itself, but again, on the lower paradigm. It's not just to repeat like the same thing. So the Kesser of Bria has also leads into Chachma of Bria, which leads to Malchus of Bria. And in the Malchus of Bria, all the 10 spheres in Malchus of Bria, which then becomes Kesser of Yetzirah. Shazel B'chinas Malchus Sheba Malchus the Bria. The Kesser of Yetzirah, the next lower world, comes from the Malchus of Bria. And this means the b'chinas keser v'chochma sheba Malchus the bria nikra ani rishon. So now you can refer ani rishon v'ani achlin in bria. That keser and chochma sheba Malchus the bria, like we explained, keser and Malchus, keser and chochma come together in ani rishon. I am the first. Now we're talking about it in the level in bria. U'malchus sheba Malchus shenasa keser liyitzira zeu ani achlin. And the Malchus of Malchus that becomes the Keser for the lower next world, Yitzira, is Ani Achrin. And then he says one more. V'chein Malchus Yitzira shenasa Keser la'asiyah. And the same thing is the next world. The Malchus of Yitzira becomes the Keser of Asiyah. And here too, Ani Rishon would be the Keser of Yitzira. And the Achron would be the Malchus of Yitzira, and that becomes the Keser of Asiyah, the lowest of the worlds. Ad b'chinas Malchus sheba Malchus, to the point that it becomes Malchus of Asiyah, shub b'chinas Keser v'reish v'sherish, the Keser Asiyah, till the Malchus of shub b'chinas Keser v'reish v'sherish le'elam Asiyah, right? Malchus, yeah. Sorry. Malchus Yitzir nasa keser la'asiyah. Abchinas Malchus sheba Malchus of Yitzira. Shubchenes keser v'reish v'sherish le'elam asiyah. That becomes the keser, the crown, that above state, but the kingship and the head. Because again, reish l'sherish le'elam asiyah, the head and the root of the world of asiyah. Shal zen nemer malchusei b'chol mashallah. His kingship is in all domains. In other words, there's a kingship, Malchus, and a Keser in each world, basically. I think that's how he's teaching it. Okay. So what we derive from this is the following: that this process that we've been discussing, first in macrocosm, from Keser of Atzilus all the way to Malchus of Atzilus. Keser Atzilus, Rashis of Atzilus, Chachma of Atzilus, all the way to Malchus of Atzilus, exists within Malchus of Atzilus itself, the 10 spheres in Malchus. The same process continues in Bria to Yitzira, Yitzira to Asiyah. Obviously, as I said, it's all in a lower level. They're not the same in the intensity of the divine, because Bria is a creation. Atzilus is not. Atzilus is an emanation. Yitzira is a lower level of divine revelation, and Asiyah is even lower. But this is the many, many steps that really make it the true interface that allow the flow to work. And in a sense, like a hologram, it repeats itself, but repeats itself again in a lower dimension. So, for example, when we say we have Ratzon and Chachma, a human being, you have a desire to build a house, and then you use your wisdom to design it, and then it develops into a whole thing, and then you build a house. So you can't compare that. You could say that's Nishtalshlu Mehen, Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that evolved from God's faculties. But you can't say the Chachma of a human being is the Chachma of Atzilus. So the fact is, you can have the same process in our own lives, but it's on a far lower level. It's on a material level, physical level. Whereas in the higher levels, it's more of a spiritual level. So what needs explanation is what's the difference between how Keser and Malchus are, let's say, in Atzilus, than how they are in Bria and how they are in Yitzira. That's not the scope of this mimer, because the Rebbe Rashab is not coming to explain that. I can explain it, but not right now, because I want to continue with the mimer. But that will definitely help understand how a generalist Seder Shtalshlus, that's how it works. The same structure, but it takes on another dimension as it works its way downward, to the point that we can actually tangibly relate to it. So, for example, when we say there's fire and water, they originate from, or water and fire originate from Chesed and Gvura. So water is a physical water that is wet, and so on, but it has those properties that originates from the spiritual archetype called Chesed. First Chesed of Yesiyah, then Chesed of Yitzira, Chesed of Bria, till Chesed of Atzilus. And at each level, it becomes more and more ethereal and less material, more oil, less keli. In Tanya, actually, in Perek Vov, I believe, where the Alter Rebbe says, he says that everything's ishtalshel. He says, the Esser spheres of Atzilus, mislapshes, Be'esser spheres the Bria, which is then in turn enclosed in the 10 spheres of Yetzirah, in the 10 spheres of Asiya. That's how ishtalshelus works, where higher levels there's much more divine revelation, and it gets more and more concealed as it dresses up in new garments. But the process is a similar one in each level, Keser through Malchus. So that's summing up what we just learned until the bottom of the page here. Continuing on, Ubchinas, next page, 1218. Ubchinas Keser Malchus da Asiya. Now we're talking about the end, the bottom of Asiya. It also has Malchus, has Keser within Malchus. Hu hamelech hamarimim v'amisnasi meis elam da Asiya. So when we say hamelech hamarumam, the king, that's exalted king, Remamus. V'amisnasi meis elam. So you may recall we learned earlier, hamelech hamarumam levade. There's an expression that he's just exalted. Period. But then it says hamisnasi meis elam. He's higher than the days of the world, which means the structure of the world. So that it means he's relating to the world. So that exists also on every level. But it also, Hamisnasi Meis Elam Dasiya. So Keser Malchus Dasiya also is exalted, but it's now related, it's relevant to, it's relative, I should say, relative to the Elam, the Meis Elam of Asiya. Okay, let me stop for a moment. It's still not over this topic. He's going to go now backwards. Remember, we started with Atzilus, but the Rebbe Rashab wants to be thorough. He's going to now move backwards from Atzilus all the way up to Ak, to Lifnei Atzimtzum. That this concept of Malchus that we're discussing, Ani Rishon of Ani Achrin, Kesama, is not only an Atzilus and lower. He just explained Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiya, but it also goes all the way up, higher than Atzilus to Ak, all the way to Malchus of Ein Sof Lifnei Atzimtzum. But I just want to pause for a moment if anybody wants to clarify anything. And if not, let me just finish this point because it's all part of this picture.
Yes. What is Yemais Eilam again?
Literally means the days of the world, but it means the structure of time in this world. When you say
that's
you could just say God is, like we said, Esnasus Atzmi means he's just fundamentally in a transcendent state. When you say Amisnasim Meisela means he's higher than, and he's it's transcendent compared to the structure of Elam of Asiya in this case.
So that's lower than Malchus the Asiya?
That is Malchus the Asiya. Here the verse is not going into distinguishing the levels. I just said it. But basically, Malchus Asiya, Hu HaMelech HaMerumam HaMisnasim Meisela. Bottom line is this pasuk is not Hamarumam Levade. This pasuk, he's exalted and elevated higher than Yemei Selam. So that's the relation relative to Yemei Selam. You can ignore what I said about Hisnas. I was just trying to contrast it to another state where he's completely removed and he's not in relation to Yemei Selam. Okay? Good.
Is it correct to say that there is a form of symptom at each descending level?
It's hard to hear you. You're
in one world or the next.
I cannot hear you. You're broken up. I didn't hear what you said.
Okay. Let me try again. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Is it correct to say that there? Okay. Is it correct to say that there is a form of symptom at each interval, at each junction between each world, between the Malchus of the higher world and the Keser of the next world?
Yes, it's usually called a parsa. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll tell you furthermore.
Thank you.
There's a tzimtzum even between in the world itself, between Keser Malchus and a Chachma of Malchus, to Chachma and Bina. There's always, as things go down, there's always going to be some concealment. That's why there's a hierarchy of higher and lower.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Val derech zeh, hu be'eses spheres that Atzilus, the Malchus, the Ak. So now he's moving up. The same thing as the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Now the question is why he calls it Atzilus, the Atzilus, the Malchus, the Ak, Nasa Keser, the Atik. It's interesting. He uses the expression Esses spheres, the Atzilus, the Malchus, the Ak. Because Atzilus, the world of Atzilus means the world of emanation. When you say Hatzalas Esses spheres, you can refer to any world and say there's a Hatzalah, the higher worlds. So it looks like that's what he's saying, because the word Atzilus threw me here. He says, Al derech zeh be'esses spheres, the Atzilus, the Malchus, the Ak, but you don't have Atzilus yet. So he's saying the 10 spheres of Atzilus, meaning the ones that emanated, that are Malchus, the Ak, Nasa Keser v'Atik l'Atzilus. That becomes the Keser and Atik l'Atzilus, because as I said, we only discussed Atzilus and downward. We spoke about Keser of Atzilus, into Chachma of Atzilus, all the way to Malchus, and Keser in Malchus of Atzilus, Chachma Malchus of Atzilus, Malchus of Malchus. So he's saying the same thing is upward. The Keser of Atzilus, just like the Keser of Bria, came from the Malchus of Atzilus, or the Malchus of Atzilus, the same thing, the Keser of Atzilus, Keser and Atik of Atzilus, comes from the 10 spheres in Malchus of Ak, which is higher than Atzilus. But he does say Esses spheres, the Atzilus. So you have to say he means here Atzilus, meaning not the world of Atzilus, but the world, meaning the Atzilus, unless he means Atzilus, the Klolos. No, I don't think so. Possibly. But he does use the word Atzilus, which is not common usually. So I'm just thinking he means emanations, not so much Atzilus as in the world of Atzilus. V'cheinu b'chlolos hishtalshlus, and the same it is in the general cosmic order, the parts of the Ak, because the same thing is with Ak. Where did Ak come from? Ak is also a world, the first of worlds. The parts of the Ak, the structure of Ak, shenetzal ma'atzmus erein sof. Yeah, netzal. He uses the word netzal. That emanated from the core of erein sof, the Malchus, the Ein Sof, nasa keser la'ak. So also Ak is subject to this. Ak also has a keser of Ak. That keser of Ak comes from the Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. The Malchus, the Ein Sof, Klula, Gam came Esses Spheres, Mina Keser El Ada Malchus. Because also Malchus, the Ein Sof, encompasses all the 10 spheres, just like Malchus of Atzilus does, from Keser to Malchus. This is called the 10 hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum. But I'm going to stop here because he's going to explain that next. In other words, coming to now, he's going to explain Ani Rishon v'Ani Achron. He explained it in the microcosm. He broadened it out now into all of Ishtalshlus, and now he's broadening it all the way to before the Tzimtzum. So we're going to have a picture here of the entire picture from the beginning that we've learned till now, all the way to it's in the microcosm of how it works in Atzilus. Now, I'll leave you with one final thing before we stop here, that Malchus of Ein Sof, the 10 spheres in Malchus of Ein Sof is called Atzilus the Klolos. That's Atzilus, the macrocosm. Ak is Bria de Klolos, Bria and macrocosm. So you see how it's so actually quite eloquent in the structure of it all. So you have it all in macrocosm, which of course is a much, much higher level. And we'll talk about that. But the same idea originates all the way in the highest levels. Because if you remember in volume 2, especially in Tzadik Dalet from the Friedrich Rebbe, we learned how within the Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, the desire to be a melech arises there. We talked about it till now in Keser of Atzilus, all the way to Malchus of Atzilus, and the other worlds. We're going to bring it back now and understand how it is in the highest levels of Erein Sof, where the first stirrings, so to speak, where God first begins in the divine consciousness to determine and to create the structure of existence. So whatever we learned is now going to be applied to the highest levels. But of course, before the Tzimtzum, everything is not in any type of form or shape. It's all conceptual in the sense that it's all within God's consciousness that he's choosing to begin to envision and shape an existence that would come after the Tzimtzum. So that's where we're up to the top of page 1218. As I said, the rest I want to learn slowly when we're learning on Sunday, more deliberately instead of rushing through it. So we're on the top of page 1218. Any questions?